First of all, I guess I'd like to start off with what was your reaction when you found out that you were being inducted into the Lincoln Academy of Illinois?
Well, I think first of all, I thought, you know, I'm now retired, or at least like to say semi-retired, and I'm thinking, well, gosh, I thought I just received all the awards and honors and accolades and things when I was a member of Congress, that once you're out, what more is there to be recognized for? And so I had heard of the Lincoln Academy, been invited to its proceedings. That never really worked out all that well in the past, and we had several of my hometown Peorians who were active in it, and I always knew it was a very prestigious thing. So when it came, when the letter came, I thought, oh my gosh, you know, how about that? And was very excited about telling my wife about it, and said, now we're going.
Well, you sure are in some distinguished company.
Oh, well, and how. And looking back over watch the little video of former proceedings and the people who preceded us, and as being laureates, and boy, a few that I was a little surprised. I didn't realize of their connection to Illinois, you know, and but it's there, and it's a very distinguished array of people.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
very complicated to be, or complimented to be among the company.
Yeah. Well, this is sort of a human interest type interview that we do, and it'll go all probably over a lot of different ground. But I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you about is what attracted you to a life in public service? It was not very long after the war, and you're going to college that you ended up in Congress. Tell me about how you got drafted into that.
Well, you know, it's amazing, and I'm going to be talking to a commencement in another couple of weeks, and you know, when you look back over now, it's not 50 years, but 49 years ago, and you know, what was it like for me, and how did I get started in this thing? And quite frankly, quite by accident. Although in high school, college, I was active at that level politically, you know, running for class officer, homeroom president, or stuff like that. But I never envisioned it as a life work, more of just an avocation rather than a vocation. The real critical point came when the president of Bradley University, about 2 months before graduation, called me into his office, and he said, "Bob, what are you going to do after graduation?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, I could go on, I think I'm going to law school, but I've also taken a lot of insurance courses. I like dealing with the public and their security." And he said, "Well, I tell you, I have a friend who's running for Congress to succeed Everett Dirksen, who is voluntarily retired, and he needs a man Friday. And it's Judge Velde down in Pekin, and I want you to go down and, if you will, have an interview with him." And I said, "Well, shucks, I didn't take any journalism courses, or I couldn't write a press release, or I was involved in politics, but nothing to the extent that." He said, "You just go have the interview." And so I did. And it's amazing, we hit it off. And the judge said, "Well, I'm running for Congress, and now and I need some help, and President Owen says that you're kind of individual that he's observed on campus that would fit right into this thing." And so after quite a lengthy interview, he says, "Of course, we can't pay very much, you know, on a campaign thing." And bottom line is, I agreed to go to work after my graduation for $30 a week. And that was in 1948, after my graduation, after the war was over, and I was 3.5 years behind time, having spent that amount of time in the service. And so I've often thought about it, and was told by my father, you know, money isn't the most important thing, at least initially, to what can you learn through the process. And so I signed on with the judge. He was successful in winning, although it was a tough year. He won by 5,000 votes, and it was the Truman year when the big corn and bean land, man.
Growing up in southern Illinois, it was always such a big deal to come up here, and it was relatively cool in the summer because you had all the wind.
Yeah.
So the judge won his election, and he went to
And then I went to Washington, supposedly as his AA, and here there were people like Mr. and Mrs. John Gomian, who worked for Everett Dirksen, who really were experienced, and here I was kind of superimposed on top of them when frankly I had all these things to learn. But nevertheless, that was good tutelage, and I spent 8 years in as an AA to my predecessor before he voluntarily decided he'd had enough of it and said, Bob, you ought to gear yourself up to run. And I did.
And you won.
And I won in a 5-man spirited primary the first time around, and that was good education too, I'll tell you. And that was one of the things I think that dissuaded the judge from running. He was very controversial. In his second term, he was catapulted to chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which in those days was really, there was the advent of television, televised hearings, and all that sort of thing, and the so-called McCarthy era. And he had a primary opponent all 4 times and a general election. And, you know, that's to have, it's bad enough running every 2 years, let alone to be opposed in the primary, and then you got double the campaigns. So I ran and was successful, and that was way back in 1956.
What was Washington like when you took office?
Oh, well, you know, they still had these temporary buildings down the mall that were built during the course of the war to house all the influx of people coming into Washington for the war effort in the Pentagon. Of course, it had been built, obviously, but they needed all this expanded room. And segregation was still there, although it was a federal jurisdiction. It didn't take me long to learn that, my goodness, it was still, you know, it was except black, white here and there, and even to the extent of when you go into a restaurant these days and there may be a bar, you know, and you stand up and have a little toddy before sitting down, just take your, oh, that's forbidden. You can't have stand-up drinking, you know, in the city of Washington. Coming from a distillery town like Peoria, well, that was an education in itself, too.
You would have served under leadership of Sam Rayburn, right?
Oh, and he was I have a wonderful picture of him in my office, or it's a plaque, really, that I was awarded some years ago in honor of Sam Rayburn, and he was the ultimate as a speaker.
What was it like serving under him?
For me, very educational. I was very fortunate when I first went to Congress then to have as my first chairman of my subcommittee on government operations, John McCormick, who ultimately became majority leader and Speaker of the House of Representatives. My ranking member, Republican, was one Clarence Brown, who was then father of Brown, with whom I served, and was a very big power in Republican politics. Well, having as my first subcommittee chairman and ranking member men of such stature in the Congress was a real educating thing for me, even though I had the advantage with 8 years as an AA. I knew every member of Congress by name when I was elected. It was an advantage. And of course the new members I had to learn just like in my own class, but it helped me a great deal to get started, and was elected president of my freshman class, so it didn't take me long to get rolling, you know, but it was a different experience in those days.
I read something about Sam Rayburn here a while back about how he just didn't, how times have changed. He didn't want to deal with television. Would never go on it. He did it once, did not care for it, and he said, you know, if I go and meet the press or something like that, you're going to want me on. Everybody else, I just don't feel like this is something I should do. Can you imagine that's such a change?
Even though he was chairman of the Commerce Committee before he was elected Speaker.
It's such a, can you imagine? I guess I'm having trouble imagining Congress doing so much of its work out of the limelight of these things.
Yeah, but I tell you, you know, when we began electronic coverage of the House and Senate, that was a controversial thing. I was rather skeptical at first, because I wondered, well, now, how much showboating are we going to have take place? And we've had some instances. I've had to admonish junior members sometimes with coming on the floor with what I thought was disrespectful of the House, where it did not put us in a good light, and some of the antics that took place. But I'm convinced after these years that it was a good thing to have the proceedings of the House and Senate covered, electronic coverage, and there have been abuses, but you know, you got to weigh the bad against the evil, just like in a bill sometimes. Well, I don't like it all. I got my objections, but I'll be for it on the strength of the good overcoming the bad, or the positives over the negatives. And I think that's happened and then of course even extending into the hearing room, some of the other things. I think it's really been a good force in helping to educate the American public on how the institutions really do work. And it gives them a better insight. Now, be nice if everybody would watch it, but you have people today talking about C-SPAN junkies, you know, or they'll phone in, and it's a kind of a limited number, but they are intense on both sides, and that's good for society. The activists in both parties that really know what when they get up to speak in a public forum, they can draw on experience firsthand, and excuse with no disrespect to any member of the media who might be questioning, it's unfiltered. I mean, that's it. That's the raw thing. It wasn't what somebody else recommended or their view of the speech.
You had an opportunity to learn from, as you said, some real giants. You know, of course, you worked, I imagine, very closely with Dirksen.
Absolutely.
What was it like to work alongside a man like that?
Well, he was just one. I like to think of him as my mentor because I learned so much at his feet. And he was, of course, and then it made me very proud when I'd go over to his office and, and he'd introduce me as his congressman. He was from Pekin, of course, I was from Peoria. And I watched him and observed him. Of course, he was given with such a gift of eloquence that was unsurpassed, let's face it. That was number one, so that when he made a case, he could communicate it in clear, understandable terms. Same thing in his campaigning. Why was it that people would really fill the halls to hear Everett Dirksen? Because he'd given one whale of a speech. Now, admittedly, sometimes you'd ask people afterwards, gee, that was just one whale of a speech, and you say, what did he say? Well, let's see, not all together, but it was usually filled with such flowery language, and descriptive language that you couldn't forget it. You say, boy, if we want to really get the old audience cranked up, let's get Everett Dirksen to come do the job. And his colleagues respected him for that too, obviously. But moreover than that, he was very smart and gifted, and of course, he'll always go down the annals of our history as being a real key in the civil rights movement when that was the big issue in the country at a very critical time in our history. And so many other, the field of foreign policy, and where we out here in Illinois were, and under the influence of Colonel Bertie McCormick and the Tribune at that time, and isolationist America, and why should we be thinking in terms of abroad when, frankly, now that our responsibilities are what they are as the superpower with the nuclear capability and defense and all the rest, that it was necessary that we know what was going on beyond our borders, and so he was a prominent figure. Unfortunately, having been afflicted with emphysema, was taken far too young, relatively speaking, because he was a very vigorous man to be able to give us many, many more years had it not been for his health.
I got the impression from, even now, I was fairly young at that point, but I got the impression that he was a man who, although the Democrats were in power, he enjoyed almost total respect from both parties.
No question about it. And of course, he and Lyndon Johnson got along quite well. Of course, after Lyndon moved up to the White House, and they had been, leaders together. As a matter of fact, one of the other things that I enjoyed doing occasionally was the senator had me over in his office after hours, after 5 o'clock, and back in the little back room, it was a sociable kind of thing. You had the other senators over, and I got to meet them then at that time, and then you learned what it was really like to have this camaraderie and among members of the opposite part, your own party, sure, but also of the other party, so that when it really came to work time, you were able to work together in a very cooperative way, although never diminishing the intensity of the debate on the floor, in that case of the Senate, in our case on the House. It's got to be there. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I have to kind of admonish my colleagues, or at least in my latter years serving, was, but don't cross the line of impugning one's motives simply because they're opposed to your point of view. Keep the argument on the substance of the issue, not on the personality. And I have some real concern today that we've lost some of it. Now, that doesn't mean that didn't happen in our history. Gosh, if you go back, some of our members were clubbing others with their canes. I used to take visitors up the stairway, and I used to show, this is where so-and-so got hit by so-and-so. But let's face it, we think we live in an era of some discipline and civility and respect for one another's opposing views, that we don't project the best image when the debate degenerates to personalities versus substance of the debate.
Civility is a word that's often applied to you when people talk about Bob Michel. They feel very strongly that was one of the things you always brought to the floor when you were there, and I sense that they feel that's missing now.
Yes. Well, there's no question a number of people, well, it's nice to be asked, people, well, we sure miss you, Bob, or I wish you were back, or blah, 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 or you always seem to have an ear for your opponents, and it was true. When I left the Congress, it was a sad moment for me because I loved it. I loved the work. It was enjoyable. And the people, boy, when President Clinton awarded me the Presidential Medal of Honor, and I just felt moved. I'd known of no House member who, while he was serving, had received the award maybe afterwards. And I remember I just had to tell the Speaker Foley and the folks acknowledged me one day on the floor, and I just had to feel like, I'd like to think that what the President was doing was rewarding the Congress for just being the Congress and an institutional part of government that's very important. I can't remember exactly what it said, but it was a moving kind of thing for me.
What was for you in public service, what was the most satisfying thing about being in Congress, the things you could do for your fellow countrymen?
Well, there's no question but that, people say, when all else fails, go see your congressman. And it's like the alderman, they can't get your garbage and taken care of and other things. It was kind of a court of last resort. I've tried everything. I've been bugged by the FBI or the Internal Revenue Service or this or that, and I'm at my wit's end, Congressman. This doesn't seem to be working, and that. Where do I turn? And would you intercede for me? Well, there are legitimate cases, and there are those that, well, I'm sorry, but that's out of my. I think you have to take your medicine. But I'll tell you, it's that being able to be of service to people, and yes, being at the focal point of where the action really is. Hey, you're really determining what other people are going to have to, the laws under which they're going to have to live. Before I left the Congress today, now they've taken the step, and I remember saying our rules should be of such a nature that what we impose on the general public should also apply to ourselves. And unless that's the case, we get carried too far afield, and it's been pretty tough medicine for some of the members to live by that today. But that it's a good rule. And then, of course, when I became leader, then it was all much more profound, because then I was invited up to the White House meetings on a weekly basis. I was with my colleagues in both House and Senate in the leadership, where foreign policy was actually developed, where my views were actually being asked, where you really, it was really at the focal point of the action, and that's very satisfying. Of course, I think it culminated probably on that when President Bush and the Gulf War, and needed the authority to use force if he was going to fully implement his policy. We had a very spirited debate that day. It was my resolution with Mr. Solars of New York that would authorize the president to use force. And that's a very emotional one, and particularly for me, because here during the course of the war I was a combat infantryman in France and Belgium, Germany, and finally got hit and out of commission. But I was, from private, went up through the ranks to in the enlisted ranks, but I was always following orders. I had nothing to say about what would happen, when I'd go on patrol, when we'd advance, or I was always being told. That's the military. And when I read after the war was over of some of the actions we were in, I was there, and I always wondered why this or that. But I never knew anything about it. Well, it was very narrowed down to platoon level. And yes, a lot of dying and suffering. And then I had come full circle where I was elected to Congress, where I am making the decision to send another generation to the war, which really influenced my life, and it was a life and death issue. And I can still recall Tom Foley telling me, "Bob, I remember when you came up to the speaker's chair and before the vote, and I hadn't made my closing argument yet." And I said, "Tom, boy, this is this is a real tough. It's been a good debate, but it's a tough one for me emotionally, and I'm going to have to let it hang out during the course of what I say, and it'll be me speaking from my heart. In the end, I'm going to have to say yes. I'm coming to that, and you're probably going to be voting no. But we'll respect one another after it's over, and of course I hope we win." Well, thank heavens that after we had the authority and with the good planning of the Bush administration and Colin Powell and Schwarzkopf and all the rest in implementing the action, that the minimum, in that debate, they were talking about thousands of body bags, and if you're on the other side and you want to really make it a tough thing to vote for, it got to talking about gruesome things. And so when it all ended up that we won, and it was with a minimum loss of life, that was very satisfying for old Bob, I'll tell you.
You worked with, let's see, every president from Truman on, right?
Yes.
Tell me about your favorites.
Oh, goodness, that's always a tough one. They all have their strong points, and maybe some of them have their weak points. For me, I guess it comes down more, while I was quite close to Nixon, even though I was not leader yet, although I was in the beginning up the leadership ladder, he was a member of a group called the Chowder and Marching Club, which also is a group of closed Republicans, mostly conservatives, who felt strongly about the real core philosophy of our party, and we stuck together and voted together, and pretty much of a hard line. And I always did everything I possibly could in the early days to further Nixon's advance up the ranks and to support him for president, and even in the impeachment, right up until now Judge Wiggins from California, who was on the committee at that time, said, "Bob, there was an admission this afternoon and our case is lost." And at that time we just knew, well, we couldn't do it anymore. And then the conversation accelerated to the degree that the president finally felt he had to step down. But I was in the room the night before the night he actually did resign, and was the only one that night who had presence of mind to pull out an envelope and scratch down some notes of who was there and what the mood. I called it afterwards. The next morning I quickly fleshed it out, little bits of things I could quickly remember. Turned out to be about 3 pages, single spaced. And I said a room full of tears, because here was Senator Stennis and Eastland on the Democratic side, and Democratic congressmen of conservative persuasion, along with some of ours. Dean Birch was our national chairman at that time, and others. And so I had those all listed, and I gave the best I could. When Nixon finally resigned, and it was quite some time before there was a reapproachment. I always felt like those of us who were in that club, when the going got tough, were forced out of the circle got smaller. And one thing I've always learned from that: if a president's in trouble, or like say, better that his circle widens and his advisors, rather than going to the cocoon. And I always felt, incidentally, having talked about Everett Dirksen before, if there was one individual who could have made a difference in that, I think it would have been Everett Dirksen, because he was close enough to Nixon, could talk to him like a duck jackal, say, Mr. President, you better fire those fellows, as only Everett could say it. And whether or not it had been successful or not, but he passed away before that opportunity happened. And so we have to go back there. But then after that, as I have in my memorabilia a very touching letter, handwritten by the President. Bob, you captured, from what I recall of that evening, you captured it very well. And I'm sorry if you felt, as I made mention that night, I hope I haven't left you down, because I had told the President in my letter, you did leave us down. And I am so sorry for it. But now we ought to open up talks again. Well, of course, then by the time, then I had him, when I was a leader, brought him back to talk to the caucus. He did a beautiful job. He still had that organizational mind. 1, A, B, C, 2, A, B. Everything was organized, and he could really develop, particularly in foreign policy, a very good thing. So he had his strong points, although, he ends up somewhat in disgrace. Ronald Reagan was beautiful for me to work with, because I was his leader. I was elected when he first came to Congress, and that was a joy. He was just, I'm so distressed that I can't talk to him today, because the last time I went out to the library, and Nancy said, well, Bob, best that you just, communications, you may get a response back, but he may know you and he may not, and it was in his present condition. And that was very disturbing, And of course, George Bush was always a good friend. They had a lot of good golf games together, and comrade. And on the Democratic side, Jimmy Carter was. I always felt like I was a friend of Jimmy Carter. He was always I always thought very sincere. And when since he's left the presidency, in that habitat and all the other things, he's devoted himself still to public service and to trying to resolve differences. He's a good, genuine man who I will always respect. Although on some of the issues, man, we took that and hammer and tongs, and double-digit inflation and all the rest of the things that were happening. So Jack Kennedy, I didn't get to I was too young yet to really really get to know him. And Lyndon Johnson, there wasn't that much of a rapport there until I became in the leadership. When you're dealing more fully with him, then you really get to take the measure of the man.
Let me ask you again about Reagan. A lot has been said about Ronald Reagan and the vision he had for the presidency. And I think the way that a lot of folks now, as we're sitting down to watch it, my God, Reagan was president and the Cold War ended.
Yes.
That was the last thing a lot of people would have expected.
Right.
At that time. What do you think the world is going to owe Ronald Reagan in terms of a legacy?
Oh, well, I tell you, they owe him much more than he's, at least up to this point, been given credit for. And I think as historians look back, because he had to fight it all the way. I'm reminded of how when he, in his Eureka speech to a commencement class, talked about START. And at that time, the Democratic adversaries were talking about freezing weapons, and Ronald Reagan had the vision to say, we got to go beyond that. It's reducing the level of armaments and nuclear weapons that I want to strive for. And then, but all the time talking that way kept our defenses built up strong, always to make absolutely sure we were never going to be shortchanged when it came head to head with the Soviet Union, and even to the degree of Star Wars, and where people poo-pooed it, and I've been in controversial debates on the subject. The point was that it got up to that level where the Russians couldn't match it and still maintain some degree of satisfaction with their public at home, whereas we had the resources and he had the vision and the communication skill to marshal the forces to get us to the point where we could face the Russians down, and it was done in a peaceful sort of way, to the degree that the whole thing, from the standpoint of the old Soviet Union, it just became obliterated, you know. And it was a wonderful thing that he did, but it was peace through strength. Peace through strength.
One of the things that it's mentioned, of course, in your biography, in your notes here, is about the Technology Transfer Act.
Mm-hmm.
That was an especially momentous bill for you. Could you speak to why that was such an important thing?
Well, here in Peoria, we had what we called an agricultural research laboratory. It's one of the 4, well, now 5 in the country. Everett Dirksen got the initial money for it way back when. I got on the same subcommittee on agricultural appropriations when I was in the Congress, and I always liked the kind of work they were doing then, trying to get utilization research for the products we could produce in such abundance, corn and beans in Illinois particularly. And then we were doing so much research there and it ended up being on the shelf. But when the Japanese or some enterprising foreigners would come to this country to see what we were doing, why, they could take whatever they saw on the shelves and look thumbing through the books, photocopy it, print it, everything, take it back home, utilize it. And I'm thinking, what chumps we are. We're giving our foreign competitors, our research, and we forbid it because, quite frankly, this was government-funded research. It might help private enterprise and some business to make money or to make a profit. It's a dumb philosophy. So we changed that through the Technology Transfer Act by even making it possible, for example, for a government scientist who might be working for the government, but through his initiative and resources, it seemed to me, maybe had some peremptory right for a patent right, or at least some to share in the bounty of what good he found in the research. So it's turned out to be very helpful. We've gotten a number of industries that have taken upon and supported it, indirectly putting back into the. So that was one of the nice things we've done.
Any other? I know. Gosh, in the course of a congressman's terms out there, probably in your case, tens of thousands of votes you took.
Yeah.
Could be somewhere in that.
Gosh, I don't know. Right.
What would be the toughest and then the most rewarding, the votes that you've taken?
Oh, it's awful. It's tough to really. Sometimes I can't remember what I did this morning or yesterday, but when I tell you, I think one of the reasons I was elected leader was because of my service on the Appropriations Committee and what I did there. Now, in my party, the overall objective: how can you reduce federal spending? When I was first sent to Congress, it wasn't with a big chart, a laundry list of things to do. Bob, go to Washington, cut the cost of government, get it off our back, and reduce my taxes. That was my mission, that was my charge. And so when I got on the Appropriations Committee and tried in various controversial areas, particularly in the health, education, and welfare field, I talked to a group the other day. I said, I remember when I went on the Health Committee, and the National Institute of Health was getting $200 million a year for the great work that they do. Today, that money's up probably about $8 billion. Now, I was responsible in part for some of those increases, but I thought that was a real valid area for government research to be focusing on, and has paid off rewards many more times. But some of those votes then, when the argument then is couched you want to deny this child this kind of benefit or that kind of cure. And I said, well, we are a little limited to what we can spend this year. Now, I hope eventually we can get, well, all those votes. Sometimes we were, and when our opposition, I remember one day they purposely demanded roll calls on 27 of those cutting amendments. And every one of them was a tough one for the time being, so that when you run the next time, you get charged, why, he isn't for anything, you know. Whereas put in the overall context, what you were, you had a different goal of trying to bring the country's finances under some control, so that eventually you could say, yes, maybe we don't have to have our taxes increased, we ought to have them diminished. And then, of course, on the foreign policy, like I mentioned earlier, on the Gulf War, that was really one of the tough ones, and some of the more satisfying ones. Oh, I guess I can't remember specifically, but you know, all my 38 years in the House was as a member of the minority party. I never chaired my subcommittee or my full committee during any one of those years, except in the last day that I served, Tom Fulmy asked me to come up, you know, to bring the House to order, and in a minute or so. So whenever I was leading a minority, and to be able to win anything, you know, that was satisfying, because I could have a perfect vote, as I did in the early 80s there when we were changing expenditures and reconciliation taxes, and the Reagan Revolution was just getting started. There were 7, 8 votes there, won by 3 and 4 votes. I had 192 solid Republicans, you know, to keep them together, that's one thing. Then to reach over on the other side of the aisle to get 27, 28, whatever it required at that day, for that magic number to win. That is satisfying for a legislator who wants to win. And, you know, and then the other thing is standing down there in the well of the House on a given issue and being able to take on 434 of your contemporaries who are out there to puncture your case, maybe. And you can stand your ground, and you're well enough posted and informed that, again, in the end, you win the amendment. It's satisfying.
Yeah, because you're up against some of the best minds of the time.
Yeah, right.
There you are.
We'd like to think so.
Well, yeah. How would you describe what sort of role should the federal government have in the daily life of people? I always love to ask.
Well, of course, it should be a limited role, you know, and as Lincoln put it so well, you know, that you know, government should be doing only that for which the individual does not have the capacity to do for himself. That government always, well, primarily it's a security issue for the federal government to preserve. We got very little to do about preserving the security of the country when it comes to warring parties and that kind of thing. But other than that, then it also has an obligation, you know, to try and keep its finances in order so that the money is not debased, and that the people's then domestic security and livelihood, that the climate is preserved for their feeling that once through school, that the opportunity will be there, that we never stifle opportunity and in government's role. But then there are those occasions, limited in nature, where a federal standard might be in order, and to lead the way, maybe in some new ventures. Let's face it, in space, how could just about had to be government to give that initial, and some of the other things we're currently doing, where the government has so many more resources. But if, quite frankly, the federal government takes the position of encouraging the private sector through either tax policy to encourage it, why, it ought to do that, because I'm not one of those who think government knows all. We've got some very smart, dedicated, wonderful people working both in the bureaucracy and in elected positions of government. But the system is And then, of course, to preserve what our forefathers did with a minimum of tinkering by way of amendments to the Constitution. We've had several, and they've been effective, and we had one that we thought was effective and had to repeal the amendment, you know. But so far, I tell you, nothing so satisfying for me in those closing days of the Congress when these emerging democracies, particularly from the old Soviet Union, and they would come over and want to know, what is it like to be a minority leader? Because they came in a system where there was only one there was only one view. Well, what place is there in a kind of a democratic society then for the minority to be worth running or have anything to say? And I say, well, look at me. Unfortunately, I've been here 38 years and I'm still in the minority, but I do feel like every day that I go to work, I've got a part to play in helping to shape public policy. And if I can pull and tug in the minority enough to deny a ruthless majority, then it's been worth it. And then the other thing is, because when they say, we'd like to pattern our Constitution after yours because we think it stood the test of time. And brother, that's nothing that more satisfying to have those who've been under dictatorships and authoritarian government and with little freedom and recognizing that, boy, that taste of freedom, boy, that's something, and we want it for our country.
That's a beautiful thought to close on.
Good.
I was going to ask you, a lot of people that I've talked to in this program series have talked about Lincoln some, and of course living just down up from the Capitol here. You ever do much thinking about Lincoln as a hero?
Well, you know, I tell you, my father was a French immigrant, and I was going to say tonight in a few little words that you know, my parents were very distressed when I told them I was thinking of getting involved in politics. They said, oh, that dirty, rotten game of politics. Why would you be, you know, and my response was, well, I thought what I learned here at home was the difference between right and wrong, and that, quite frankly, I thought that politics could be a very noble profession. As a matter of fact, Dad, I've heard you speak of one American politician in the highest of glowing terms. And he learned about Lincoln before he ever came to this country as an immigrant. And honesty is the best policy, and humbleness, and all the virtues that Lincoln had, and still, you know, that. And when I could touch that responsive chord with my dad, eventually, it took a little time, but because, you know, to say you're molded. Who were we to say we could be molded in Lincoln's image? That's too far afield. But at least as a point of reference and a standard, a high standard, to which to at least have ambitions of. Well, then that helped. And of course, it's still. If you take a visitor up to that Lincoln Memorial, and that sitting there in that chair, and then to read, you know, the address and the second and the brevity of what he said, but which lives in history because of its forcefulness in such few well-chosen, eloquent words. He was, and to be the patron saint of my party. I'm proud of it.
Is he your favorite politician?
He's got to be, and of course, for historical times, yes. Currently, you know, you have different views of those with whom you've served, obviously, in more modern times.
Is there anything that I haven't touched on?
Oh, not really. I think we've touched a lot of bases here, and
I feel very good about what
and I'm sorry my answers sometimes become too lengthy, and half of them should be or more on the cutting floor when it all ends.
Well, I will have plenty to work with, and I always save all of these so that in the future, if somebody wants to come back and take a listen to them or watch